Now, this story is complete chaos with tons of twists and turns that we really still don't know the answer to. But it actually ended up being a very important case in British history that set a legal precedent regarding self-defense. It also happens to carry a mix of both true crime and paranormal. So if you guys who are watching prefer one versus the other, then this story will satisfy the both of you. All right, let's get into the video. Hi guys, my name is Ashley, and if you're new here, I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. Now, if you guys want more short story format, check out my TikTok. I post on there on a daily basis. The link is in the description box below. Same username at HeebieJeebiesTV. And if you guys are new here as well, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. It all really does help me grow here on YouTube. I see a lot of crossover between my followers on TikTok and YouTube, so I'm super happy to have all of you guys here. Now, let's get into the story. So because of everything that went down in this story, it ended up determining that a person could be held liable for their actions, including taking the life of another person, even if they mistakenly had acted in self-defense or mistaken belief. But to understand all of that legal jargon, we have to go back in time to the early 19th century, specifically to the winter of 1803. So this story takes us to a very small rural village known as Hammersmith, located on the outskirts of London, England. It was the year 1803 when quite suddenly this small town became terrorized by an unknown entity. Terrified villagers would come forward claiming that they had been physically attacked by what they could only describe as a ghost covered in a white sheet. But other reports roaming around say that it was actually covered in animal hide. From all of these encounters, the one thing that they all had in common was that this violent ghost would usually appear around 1 a.m. sharp every night once the church bell struck. And it would end up floating down to an area known as Black Lion Lane. Speculation spread across the entire village. Locals were wondering whose restless spirit would want to come back from the dead and cause harm to them. Newspapers that were talking about this story would only increase the paranoia amongst locals, which ended up causing a form of mass hysteria across town. With unanswered questions as to who could be causing all of this harm to innocent people, the obsession to uncover the truth slowly began to brew. Locals managed to conclude that the spirit must have belonged to a man who used to live in the village. Unfortunately, this man, who I could not find the name of, but apparently he had chosen to take his own life just the year before. And the way he chose to do it was anything but a peaceful or quick way to go. This guy had chosen to slice his own throat. And with that, locals started to conclude that this must have been the man that was coming back to terrorize everyone because his spirit could simply not cross over or find peace. So with everyone kind of panicking and the newspapers talking about this, the locals trying to figure it out for themselves, the whole story ended up being dubbed as the Hammersmith Ghost. And there was one well-known encounter that stood out above the rest. And it occurred on a late evening when a wagon carrier was passing through Hammersmith. He also happened to have 16 people in his wagon, along with 8 horses pulling the entire thing. Suddenly, this Hammersmith ghost appeared out of nowhere and started attacking everyone inside the wagon. It even ended up spooking the horses quite a bit. It was said to have been so terrifying that the driver of this wagon decided to literally up and leave and ran off to hide, leaving everyone inside of his wagon to basically fend for themselves. Later that evening, there was a heavily pregnant woman, and she was said to have been outside around 10 p.m. Now, it's not exactly known what she was doing outside late that night, but she was near a local graveyard, and that's where she came face to face with the apparition. She reported that this ghost rose from a nearby tomb and then proceeded to grab her and physically assault her. Unfortunately, the terror of this entire situation ended up causing her to faint on the spot, and it wouldn't be for several hours until neighbors ended up finding her. That's where they ended up taking her, noticing that she was heavily pregnant. They ended up taking her back to her home and put her in the bed in hopes of nursing her back to health. But unfortunately, it was way too late for this pregnant woman because she ended up passing away later on that day, with many people speculating that she had passed away due to fright. However, looking at this from a more modern approach, I feel like she probably passed away due to exposure or likely hypothermia, considering she was outside for several hours, and this also happened in the middle of winter. A third story comes from a man who happened to be visiting the same graveyard. When he had his back turned to a tombstone, he said that he felt two hands grab him from behind around his neck. That's when his instincts kicked in and he started fighting whatever this was. Somehow he was able to free himself, but when he turned around, to his surprise, there was absolutely nothing or no one there, which left him completely mortified. Another story reported by the London Morning Post says that a group of local servants from a brewery were outside around 10 p.m. one evening. When they least expected it, they ended up running into the Hammersmith Ghost, and they could only describe it as being half calf, half something unworldly with enormous hooves and horns. It then proceeded to chase the men down before actually catching one of them, and then proceeded to choke him. The man was absolutely frozen in fear, and somehow he did manage to escape the grip of whatever was attacking him, but it was said that he remained ill with a very high fever for weeks after the attack. By this point, as you can imagine, the locals were just absolutely too scared to go outside into the darkness because phantom panic had taken over the entire village. Those who were brave enough to go outside after sunfall, or those that were absolutely forced to go outside for one reason or another, always made sure to carry weapons on them for protection. As time passed, more and more of these reports kept coming in about a ghost terrorizing everyone, until one night a shocking revelation came forward. In the middle of one of these attacks, it was exposed that it wasn't a ghost after all. In fact, it happened to be a person, a man, who quite literally had a white sheet placed over them. During this one attack, that sheet had fallen off, revealing the shadow of a man right before he ended up running off into the darkness, managing to conceal his true identity. Although I do find this quite interesting that people seeing this ghost, whether or not it did have a sheet over himself, I find it very interesting that people wouldn't be able to see very clearly that this was obviously someone just putting a sheet over their head and covering themselves, or even seeing down to the ground, possibly seeing this person's feet. I'm just not sure how people were not able to really make that out clearly, but let's continue. From there, patrolmen were alerted about what was going on, and because people were just way too scared, they started patrolling the streets on a nightly basis in hopes of catching this delinquent perpetrator. However, this proved to be a lot more difficult than said, since the village in question happened to have many lanes and small paths that made it really difficult to cover all of the entrances and the exits, and also kind of made it like a maze, so it was rather easy to lose someone. Many of the men took it upon themselves to also seek justice in this situation. Now, keep in mind, this was a time where, although there was some police present, it wasn't by today's standards, so citizens were often able to enforce the law as they saw fit, which kind of just led to a big mess waiting to happen. At the same time all of this was going on, there was a man named Thomas Millwood. He was 22 years old, and he also happened to be a bricklayer. Now, what's interesting about Thomas is that he always was known to dress impeccably, according to those who knew him, and he was always dressed in white. This was because of his work clothing. So he was always seen wearing clean white linen trousers, a white flannel waistcoat, a white apron, and white shoes. So essentially, he was dressed head to toe in white, if you can see where I'm kind of going with this. This all led to him being mistakenly identified as the Hammersmith Ghost not once, but twice. Now, knowing the risk that he was taking wearing this all-white uniform, Thomas's family warned him and urged him to actually wear a brown or some sort of colored coat over his uniform so he wouldn't be mistaken out in public. Unfortunately, Thomas did not listen. On January 3rd, 1804, Thomas was walking down Black Lion Lane, where the Hammersmith Ghost was known to appear for the most part. He was wearing his entire all-white attire when he was confronted by another man named Francis Smith. Now, Francis was a customs officer who had taken upon himself to track down this delinquent villager who was causing all of this chaos. Francis had been on patrol that evening, and rumor has it that he was also a little bit intoxicated from the few beers he had had at the Black Lion pub, which was located next to the Black Lion Lane. Shortly after his visit to the pub, he spotted what he thought was the Hammersmith Ghost. To confirm to himself what he was seeing and to also really kind of make sure that what he was seeing was truly a ghost and not a person, he called out to this quote-unquote spirit a few times. Francis yelled out, "Who are you? What are you? Damn you, I will shoot you." But he received no answer. The spirit simply continued to walk towards him. We would later find out that Francis's recollection of the events were also corroborated by Thomas's sister Anne, who happened to live nearby, and she heard the entire altercation go down. At this point, since Francis did not get a response from this supposed spirit, he decided to take matters into his own hands, and he truly believed that what he was seeing was actually a ghost from the shadow realm and not another human being. Not knowing what else to do and just seeing that this spirit was just approaching him, Francis completely froze, and when he was able to kind of do something about it, he ended up firing directly at this spirit. To his horror, when he got closer for an inspection of what he had just done, he realized that he had shot another person when he realized that there were puddles of blood forming around Thomas. Unfortunately, he had been shot directly in the mouth and unfortunately passed away at the scene. Francis immediately went for help and was reported as being quite upset at the entire situation, but also compliant with police, but nonetheless, he was arrested. As the investigation that night proceeded, many witnesses came forward and they all said the same thing about that evening. They all said that it was very dark and gloomy. There was quite a lot of fog, which could have caused a lot of confusion for someone. It was very hard to see across the street or even a few blocks away. So a lot of people tried to explain that it would have been easy for Francis to confuse Thomas for a spirit. Many other character witnesses would also come forward in defense of Francis, claiming that he would never intentionally harm another human, and that if he had actually shot at this spirit, it must have been out of pure fear. But regardless of how much his friends and family came forward and praised him, the coroner determined that the cause of death was due to a rash act of willful murder, which forced Francis to go to trial the following week. At trial, Francis was said to have been actually quite honest and upfront about what happened, but his defense relied on the idea that he had acted in self-defense and therefore pled not guilty. It was so evident to everyone at the court that Francis was extremely remorseful. He was said to have been so emotionally overwhelmed that he had a very hard time maintaining composure or even standing at points throughout the trial. One of the three judges hearing the entire case was named Lord Chief Baron, and he was not having any of it. Although he had heard both sides of the story, his reasoning was explained in this very stern conclusion. However disgusted the jury might feel in their own minds with the abominable person guilty of the misdemeanor of terrifying the neighborhood, still the prisoner had no right to construe such misdemeanor into a capital offense or to conclude that a man dressed in white was a ghost. In this case, there was a deliberate carrying of a loaded gun, which the prisoner concluded he was entitled to fire, but which really he was not. And he did fire it with a rashness which the law does not excuse. In all circumstances of the case, no man is allowed to kill another rashly. And with that, the three judges on the panel sent the jury to deliberate. When the jury finally reached a conclusion, it was an absolute shocker. They had all agreed that this wasn't necessarily murder, but it was manslaughter. All three judges on the panel were shocked and disgruntled because they were really expecting the jury to decide between either guilty or not guilty. And truth be told, when I was doing some research on this, it really did sound like the judges were a little bit biased, kind of just pushing for a solid guilty verdict the entire time. But let's continue. With that, the judges ended up rebuting this decision, claiming that there were no circumstances at all that would allow for a manslaughter verdict. So they ordered the jury to go back to the deliberation room, instructing them that they had to either choose to convict Francis or to acquit him. Eventually, the jury would return, and this time they had settled on a guilty verdict and sentenced Francis to death by hanging. But not only that, they also decided that his body would be donated to a college in order to be dissected. Immediately, gasps were heard across the courtroom at everyone's shock at the gravity at the sentence. Now, there are two versions of this portion of the story. Some reports say that it was a man that was present at the trial, while other versions say that it was actually one of the judges, Chief Baron himself, that said that he would report the case to the Crown, also known as King George III, to appeal this sentencing. Shockingly, the king took interest in the case and agreed that the sentence of death was just too harsh. His reasoning basically came from the fact that the town was small and they had already lost a man's life throughout all of this chaos, and basically losing another man's life was just not necessary. And with that, 3 weeks later, Francis was given a full pardon by the king on one condition, that he would complete 1 year of hard labor, which he ended up happily serving. So what does this mean for the law? Well, in summary, it means that if someone who commits a crime while acting under an honest but unreasonable belief can still be held liable for their actions. And that is where the law stood until 1984, when it was further clarified in a separate case. But let me know what you guys think about that. So after all this was said and done, people were still wondering what the truth was about the Hammersmith Ghost, and I'm sure a lot of you are too. Was the ghost a real person pretending to be a ghost, or was there some paranormal truth to all of this? Well, there are a couple theories that we'll go into here. In a surprising turn of events, a man named John Graham was reported and arrested for being a public nuisance. Apparently, he had been seen running around at night with a sheet over his head, impersonating a ghost and terrorizing the locals. This could have also potentially been the man that was seen earlier on in the story that I mentioned that people had seen with the white sheet, who ended up running off into the darkness. When he was taken to court, officials demanded to know why he would do such a thing, and he ended up explaining that he pretended to be this angry spirit in order to seek revenge on several teenagers who actually had scared his own children. Apparently, these teenagers were bullying and telling the children these terrifying stories, so he wanted to get revenge on these kids. Fortunately for him, he was let go with a warning, and that was the end of that. Satisfied with that explanation, the town of Hammersmith went back to normal, with the Hammersmith ghost no longer consuming the lives of the locals, or so at least they thought. This leads to the second theory, that the Hammersmith ghost could have actually been a real ghost. By 1824, reports started coming in about the return of the Hammersmith ghost, and this time he was said to have been even scarier. He now donned horns, hooves, and even had the ability to breathe fire like a dragon. Then in the 1930s, reports started piling up again, but this time they had changed once more. Allegedly, the Hammersmith ghost was now able to climb walls with his very long claws. These sightings would merge into another unsolved paranormal phenomenon that took over the entire United Kingdom. In 1837, we would come to know this entity as Spring-Heeled Jack, who was described as a diabolical creature who leaped from roof to roof in the middle of the night. He was also said to have had red, glowing fireball eyes, wore a black cloak, and even spoke English. But because that is a whole other story that I could do a very long video on, I will save that tale for another time. Now, the story goes on to conclude that Thomas Millwood's restless spirit continues to haunt the Black Lion pub, where his body was taken shortly after he was shot. Which, not to make light of the story, but it sounds like the Hammersmith ghost story made a full circle here. There is even a plaque on the exterior of the building reciting the events of the Hammersmith ghost. And there's also been reports of past employees claiming that the pub is now most definitely haunted. Claims of strange noises, shadows, doors shutting and opening on their own have gone and come throughout the years. But like always, let me know what you guys think. Was the Hammersmith ghost just a case of mistaken identity? Was there some crazy person going around pretending to be a ghost and terrorizing the locals? Or is there truth to the paranormal angle after all? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. I really appreciate all of your support. And check out my TikTok for more short story format. Again, the link is in my description below. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me on this story, and I will see you guys in the next video.